Looks like I've been muted as I was talking to you all. So let me restart. I welcome everyone. I'm Raj Kumar, the President Editor in Chief of Devex, and I'm really delighted to welcome all of you to a conversation I think is extremely important that we at Devex and our colleagues at the CDC group in the UK are putting on. And really, it's on a topic that I think deserves a lot more attention, and that is the impact of this global pandemic on small and mid-sized enterprises, particularly in low and middle income countries and places like Africa and South Asia and much of the rest of the world. You know, what is the stay-at-home orders, the lockdowns, the supply chain disruption? What does it all mean for those businesses? And then what can organizations who are charged with helping to build those economies to support those businesses, organizations like the development finance institutions of the world, what can they be doing to help those companies, those businesses to be more resilient? And obviously these businesses, these supply chains are essential to every economy in the world. They're essential to livelihoods and employment. So we're going to get into what we think is a pretty critical topic. And this is meant to be an interactive discussion. You're going to hear from some real experts on the topic, but we know many of you out there joining us have your own expertise. So there's a chance to throw in your questions. We want to hear them. We'll try to get to as many as we can during the course of this conversation. Let me just say a few things about how we're going to do this. We've got Chris Shipton with us, who's a fantastic illustrator. He's going to be illustrating the conversation as we talk. So you'll get a sense of some of the themes that are coming out from our discussion, some of the key bullets as we get to them. And we're also going to include you in a number of interactive polls. So as you join the discussion, you know, we want to hear your take. And in fact, we're going to start with one right now just to kind of get the blood flowing. We want to hear from all of you out there who are joining this discussion. I'm going to ask my producer colleagues to throw up that poll if they can. And as they're doing that, let me just say a word about well, here's the question. What do businesses need most to survive the COVID-19 crisis? So do they need access to flexible capital, assistance in adapting their operations and production, or advice and guidance on job protection? We want to hear your take on this question. As you think about that, as you consider it, let me just say a word about who all is joining us in this conversation. We have Yasmin Saltuklami, who is a Deputy Chief Investment Officer at the CDC Group in the UK. We really appreciate the chance to put on this event with our colleagues at the CDC Group. And Yasmin has a particularly important role there as she is leading the investment side of their COVID-19 response. So we are excited to hear from her. Again, as you answer this poll, let me tell you a little bit more about who else is joining us today. We have Vipul Parekh, who is the co-founder of an organization, a company in India that's really well known in the country called Big Basket. If you're not there in India, you're not familiar with Big Basket, let me just say, this is a place you go to order groceries, which maybe has always been important, but particularly in a moment like this is extremely important for many people across the country. So we're going to be hearing from Vipul as well. He is the Chief Marketing Officer and CFO there at Big Basket. Really happy to have him in the discussion. And we've got Jean-Paul Adam, who is the Director of Technology, Climate, and Natural Resources over at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, based in Addis Ababa. He's joining us today from his native country of the Seychelles, where he held a number of government positions, including Minister of Health. So he's going to bring us a lot of perspectives, particularly an African perspective to the conversation. We really appreciate having him as well. I'm guessing that you've all had a chance to take a look at that poll. Let's see, maybe if the producers can put up results, we'll see where we are to start. It looks like a slim majority are saying access to flexible capital, but it's pretty split between access to flexible capital and assistance in adapting their operations and production. Look, I think everybody can realize that in this really unprecedented situation, running a small or mid-sized business is enormously tough. And maybe that's a good point to bring in Yasmin into the discussion, because Yasmin, you've got 1,200 companies in your portfolio at the CDC Group. And so you're getting a pretty bird's eye view across many countries, many geographies in Africa and South Asia, many types of companies. What are you hearing from those companies? I'll just ask you to make sure you put on your camera and unmute yourself as you begin talking.
Thank you, Raj. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Hopefully my camera and mute button are working correctly now. Great. So yes, I mean, we have a portfolio that spans, so CDC Group is the UK's development finance institution. We invest in Africa and Asia for economic development. We've been doing this for over 70 years. So have seen lots of different experiences in that
But
time.
nothing like this, I'm guessing.
Nothing like this. Yeah, and what I think is really quite exciting, feels like the wrong word to use in a context like this, but I'm quite proud, I guess is the right word, to see CDC stepping up in the way it's responding to the crisis. And I think we have worked hard to become a very responsive investor to try to move quickly in decision making. And we have used all the tools in our toolkit to try to support both our portfolio, but also the economies in which we are investing. So if I can just describe the COVID response structure that we've put in place, the strategy has 3 pillars. The first is preserve, and it's really focused around preserving the impact that we've sought to create in our investments and preserving the value in the companies that we've supported with our investments. So that's about our existing portfolio today.
You want to keep those businesses in business that you've been investing in and supporting for a long time.
That's right. The second is strengthen, and that is really about utilizing investment in our portfolio or beyond our portfolio to support the response to COVID-19. And whether that's through financial intervention, and your poll just asked, is it about flexible capital? So one of the pillars of the strengthen piece of our strategy is systemic liquidity, putting capital into the markets with different target end beneficiaries in mind, into different geographies through different intermediaries, but basically trying to put capital out there. And the other piece is really focused on healthcare and basic needs with a focus on food security, water, and sanitation.
We're going to get into all of those topics as we go. I just want to let everybody know those are really important themes about access to capital. If you're a business owner, how do you get capital today? What's the picture you're experiencing? And then obviously the immediate needs around health and food in many of these countries where you have large informal economies. People can't get out easily to get food. What do we do about it? And they don't have income. But go ahead, Yasmin, tell us more what you're seeing from the business standpoint. What are businesses experiencing today?
Well, so you also asked about guidance on job protection, and it was interesting to see the response on the survey there being quite low. I'd be interested actually in the demographic that's voting in that poll to see kind of what's the perspective that's reflecting that. Actually, guidance on job protection was one of the first things that CDC was able to put out. So we've been using our capital, but also we have non-financial ways to support our portfolio. And we had 400 people participate in a webinar on job protection guidance recently. So I think there is quite a lot of demand for guidance on how to manage in a time where retrenchment is likely to be an experience that, many companies need to go through. How do you do retrenchment responsibly? Is there a way to avoid retrenchment by, say, rebalancing work staff or workflow in some way? So I think those are key questions. There are questions about how do you shift the way the company is capitalized with either rescheduling debt repayments. It's a lot of flexibility, whether it's on the capital side or the workforce side.
And yet companies who might have thought they had flexibility, they might have thought their balance sheet was strong, they had money in the bank, they were ready for anything. They didn't expect this. They didn't expect to be shut down for so long. And maybe that's a good moment to bring in Vipul to the discussion. Vipul, your business is right at the center of this. Many businesses are affected, of course, every business basically, but you're right at the center because you're delivering food to people who need it. Tell us more about Big Basket and what you're seeing right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, this was a bit of a tsunami. I think it caught all of us a little unawares. And in India, particularly, the lockdown was very sudden. It got announced with about 4 hours of notice to the whole country. In fact, a lot of chief ministers in states sort of complained that they got to know on TV, which is a funny part of it. But that gave a lot of businesses like us very little time to prepare. And one of the first things, therefore, that happened was there was panic buying. People just wanted to buy, stock up, hoard. So the demand just went through the roof. On the other side, most of the people left because people were scared. They wanted to get back home. The state borders and the city borders got locked down. Communities closed down because everybody was, sort of getting into a very protectionist kind of mode. And therefore, if you had 100 people, we are down to 30. And so in that situation where, we had 1/3 of people and demand, which was 10x, it just became absolutely impossible. And to figure out what's happening on the government side. Would they allow us to operate? Would they give us permissions to actually deploy and go and deliver stuff? Because they said, you need to have passes, you need to apply for these passes to the government. You need to download them in some cases from e-portals. In some cases, you have to physically send people to a particular office and get those passes. And those were limited. So that sort of constrained how many passes you could get. So it was very, absolutely anarchic for about a week or so. And I think, so it took us some time to really even understand what was happening, to come to grips with the situation. And then I think, so it gave us 2-3 quick lessons. And if I may just touch on them briefly. One was,
Sure.
you need to work with government, and which we had never done in the past, being fairly self-reliant and never, our whole thesis was don't go anywhere near the government, and I think you're good on your own. And so we had to learn how to reach out to them. We had to reach out at the prime ministerial office level. We had to reach out to the local governments, the local district magistrates, the local police people. So we actually formed a task force just to communicate and liaise with government. And he said, this is the most critical part, just getting them to understand why is it critical for us to operate? What service do we provide? We are providing essential food services, which are extremely critical to people under this particular environment. So it's useful for them to actually work with us and get this done. So I think that was one critical learning. How do you work with government? How do you co-opt government? And how do you get them to see your point of view and become supporters? So that was the first learning we had, and that sort of got us started. And from there, we have, the second learning was, how do you build people back? How do you bring people back? How do you ensure them it's safe to operate? How do you make sure that, that was the second big challenge. And maybe I'll talk about it a little more as you go along, but some very interesting learnings during this period.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I understand, there's still a lot of questions, right, about the lockdown in India. I think it's meant to be lifted May 18th, but there's still some questions about whether that will actually happen. So uncertainty is something, people and businesses are dealing with all over the world, and many governments themselves are dealing with uncertainty. I guess I'm curious to know, you're talking about your own employees, getting them out was hard. What about the supply chain? What about the farmers producing the products, the small factories and others creating packaged products? What about the whole supply chain that you rely on? What's your experience been like in India during this crisis?
That got completely disrupted. So small manufacturers, for example, had the same problem we had. Their people left. In fact, most manufacturing staff in India is migrant labor. And so those people just went back to the villages. They went back to their towns and cities where they hailed from, and sort of just locked themselves down. And one of the things the government did was they said, everybody will get paid. Their salaries for the next, till this lockdown goes down, all employers have to pay their salaries. And this was an advisory saying that you need to pay salaries. So people are not worried about getting the salaries back. So there was no incentive for anybody to really go back and work. So most of the small manufacturers that we work with lost their workforce. So they were in no position to supply. In fact, one of the arguments that we made to the government was that, if you want farmers to have access to market, if you want manufacturers to have access to market to sell their unsold inventory, the only people who are going to buy from them today and ship them across are people like Big Basket. Because traditionally farmers would go to actually a market and sell it, or they would actually ship it themselves. But now they don't have the resources. They don't have the permissions to actually traverse state boundaries. They can't even, enter cities. So how do you actually make sure that they don't go out of business? So one of the first things we did was to actually go back to governments and tell them, give us permission to make sure that we pick up from our farmers, allow us to operate those interstate or intrastate trucks across, so we can make sure that the farm output keeps getting back to market. And so that permission we got very quickly, because I think the government responded to alacrity. They realized this was a critical measure. And so we could quickly get farm supplies moving. And that fortunately has actually stayed the course. It's helped us a lot. It's helped customers a lot. And that part of supply chain
that's got to be a huge shift for your business to now suddenly having trucks go directly to farmers, picking up produce, bringing it to into your facilities, distribution centers, getting it out to people. Really quickly, because I want to go to Jean-Paul Adam to hear about the situation in Africa. Just give people a sense of how large is Big Basket? How many customers in India are you serving?
So we are in about 30 cities in India. We do about 7-8 million orders a month today. And so we are the fourth largest grocery business in the country.
Yeah, so you're a significant business. Amazon is one of your competitors in the country. So we're going to get back. There's lots more I want to hear about, including not just the challenges businesses like yours have faced, but what we can do about it, especially using innovative development finance tools. But let's get Jean-Paul or JP in the conversation. JP, you're joining us from the Seychelles. Let's just make sure your camera is on and your microphone is on. But I'd love to hear, Africa as a continent. There are many countries. It's hard to give an overview, but that is your job over at the UN Economic Commission for Africa. Maybe you can give us a sense of what you're seeing in terms of small and medium enterprises in the country and the challenges that they're facing, in the continent in general, and the challenges they're facing.
Thanks very much, Raj, and good afternoon from Seychelles. Good morning to you in the Northern Hemisphere. It's a great pleasure to join you today. I hope you can hear me well.
We do.
In relation to the situation in Africa, I think to understand the context first, it's important to understand that Africa faces very particular vulnerabilities, and consequently the response to the COVID-19 situation has been as urgent as for any other region, but the tools that are at the disposal of African governments and of organizations that are involved in Africa have not been the same. The main issue, for example, is the lack of fiscal space. Most African countries are running budgets that are very tight. They don't have a huge amount of stimulus that they can pump into the economy. And the stimulus that they do have is going, very understandably, first and foremost, into the healthcare response. So it's going into the front line, it's going to the procurement of PPE and of medical equipment and of human resources to deal with the immediacy of the crisis. So there is a real impact on jobs and on SMEs in particular. 71% of the African workforce is actually in the informal sector. And this is, again, linked to the structural nature of Africa's economy. We should note that there's relatively weak institutions, weak regulations. On the plus side, Africa has been doing relatively well up until this crisis. Growth has been sustained over a significant period of time. Of course, you have the conflict areas, but in other areas, growth has been sustained and has been positive, and it's translated into a growing middle class. So that feel-good story has been really disrupted in this circumstance, because a lot of these people who had reached that sort of, had left extreme poverty, they're now back on the edge. And the work that the UNHCR has done has estimated that 29 million people may descend into extreme poverty immediately linked to COVID-19. And a lot of these people, the issue is linked to the informal sector and the precarity of their employment, which is obviously linked to supply chains which have been disrupted. So in terms of the response, I think this came out in the context of Africa. The first response that's needed is fiscal stimulus, and Africa needs support for that. It cannot come only from the governments, and the UNHCR has estimated that the immediate needs is $100 billion, which sounds like a lot until you realize that I think the US is looking at just 60 billion just for airlines. So in the context of what Africa's needs, it sounds like a lot, but actually in the context of the number of countries, it's not. So in terms of following that immediate response, a few of the areas that we're looking really as priority is the food, energy, water nexus. So it means investing in the food supply network. This can help build SMEs, while at the same time ensuring that there is the immediate need of food. And it was very interesting to hear Vipul's experience in India, which is not necessarily so different from the African experience, but the infrastructure that is needed is more significant. And there needs to be simultaneous investment in the base infrastructure, as well as in building up the economic capacity to deal with that. In terms of
interesting
energy,
you use the word nexus, because those three things are very connected, right? You can't necessarily see food production stabilized if you don't have the energy or you don't have the water resources.
Exactly. There are a lot of nascent SMEs in Africa. We've done, for example, we did a workshop early in February before COVID-19 in Zimbabwe, where we were engaging with young entrepreneurs who had laptops, who had mobile phones, but the problem was they couldn't guarantee that they had electricity. They couldn't guarantee that they would have access to the network at the right time. So electricity provision, there's a huge gap still in Africa. And by bridging that gap, we empower a whole new generation of entrepreneurs. And we also ensure inclusion and tapping into, for example, ensuring that women entrepreneurs and young girls have access to the market. And the water and sanitation element is absolutely critical as well, because a huge proportion of Africans live in slums. 34% of Africans do not have access to washing facilities in their homes. And this is obviously a big issue in terms of the immediate response to COVID-19, but it's also critical for building a business. If you're going to be in food production, for example, you need to have access to water, you need to have access to sanitation to ensure the value of your business and of your investments.
Yeah, yes, been listening to JP, I can't help but think those were all infrastructure deficits. They were all needs that we had long before this pandemic, right? The lack of access to clean water or energy. And they all sound like things that take some time to invest in and move. And you're getting phone calls, presumably from your 1,200 portfolio companies saying, hey, we need, on your 3 points of preserve and strengthen and ensure health and food, we need emergency assistance here. John Paul also talked about how the international community's got to step in from a fiscal standpoint. So far, it's been mostly about debt, debt suspension of payments and things like that. You've got some tools in the development finance institutions like CDC Group to do other things. Like, what are some of the tools you have? What are you doing when you get those phone calls from your portfolio companies to really help them according to those 3 pillars you laid out?
Yeah, so we have 2 specific investment portfolios that I'll talk about. One is called Growth and one is called Catalyst. We have also got a technical assistance facility called CDC Plus, and then we have non-financial support that comes from our impact groups. I can speak across those 4 sets of tools. And I'm actually really grateful to be at an institution that has that supply of tools, because this allows us to respond to a greater set of needs. So the growth capital, that is our traditional kind of private equity debt and fund investments that go in for economic development, what we've always done and what we will continue to do. Catalyst is where we have the potential to take a flexible approach to risk in exchange for what we would in normal circumstances describe as market shaping opportunities, where we would be testing untested business models or working with companies that are trying to reach out to new customer bases that haven't yet been served. That's what Catalyst would do in a normal environment. In an environment like this, we can also leverage that tool to go after segments where the COVID impact translates to a certain type of risk that probably wouldn't suit our growth capital, and we can use the Catalyst toolkit to respond well in that regard. The technical assistance facility has also set up 2 specific facilities right now. One is for emergency technical assistance and helping our companies to navigate the crisis, and the other is a business response facility that aligns nicely to the strengthen pillar, which is really about helping to support companies, so either with investment or with technical assistance, that can actually step up and contribute to a response to COVID-19 in their country. And then finally, with there is just a lot of demand for guidance and advice from our portfolio or from co-investors or partners in the market. So we have a long list actually available on our website of guidance notes that we have been working to produce from our own team's expertise, but also in partnerships with others. And then we have also got a set of webinars that we've hosted to help get that advice out there into the market as well. I think the most important thing is that we are backed by a shareholder that has a very long-term approach, and so we're not bound.
And just so people know, your shareholder is the Department for International Development in the UK, right? The UK government ministry.
Correct.
Charged
Which
with
is,
development.
at the end of the day, the taxpayer. And I think everyone at CDC keeps that in mind every day and works with a significant responsibility to that shareholder, but also is grateful for the flexibility that brings, and that means that we can take a longer term horizon when we're making these investments and supporting these companies. And that means that we have a responsibility to step into the domain where others don't have that leisure.
We're starting to get questions in, Yasmin. I thought one really piggybacks nicely on what you've been talking about, and I'm sure we have people joining us from other development finance institutions, and they want to know, what are some of the internal roadblocks, right? You've gone from an institution that has certain portfolios and funds like you described, TA and other things, and now suddenly you're facing this crisis. How have you kind of gotten through the internal roadblocks to move and shift and change and adapt to the current crisis we're facing?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So I'm really grateful because we spent a lot of time in 2019 actually laying out what Catalyst is and what growth is, and we have all the toolkit in place now to use that well. And early on in the crisis, there was a question as to whether we should just say everything that's COVID response would be Catalyst, and isn't this all high risk, and shouldn't this just go into that bucket? And I was pretty quick to say, no, we're not throwing out all the hard work we've just completed, but actually it's a good test to check that we defined things well then, and can we still use those definitions now? And we've just completed an assessment that actually yeah, we're not feeling constrained with the tools that we have today. We're not turning down things that we feel we should be doing, which is a nice place to be. So it feels like we have enough flexibility in the toolkit. Then in terms of process, it is important to say that I think, we were very quick to set up an express investment committee so that we could take quick decisions on things, especially with existing portfolio companies if they needed an additional loan or they wanted to reconsider the structure of their financing or things like that, that we could be very quick to act in that regard. Normally, we have processes like you need to submit an IC paper a week before the meeting, all kinds of things. The team just went into extreme response mode, and everyone working very hard and trying to be extremely responsive and quick and adaptive to the needs of the companies that were coming forward.
Yeah, as Vipul described, government restrictions or requirements at a time like this can be a challenge. If and those may be there for good reasons during normal times, but at a moment like this, it's particularly tough.
Yeah, and I think the other dimension that's really important and will be with us for some time is the fact that due diligence changes in nature when you can't meet people in person. And so we're working now to define what does remote due diligence look like for CDC, and how do we gain reliance on what types of things could be sufficient for us. So that's a live exercise right now. And then the other thing that I wanted to come back to that I think both Vipul and Jean-Paul touched on that I find really interesting right now is the role of the public sector, especially in these markets where the fiscal response is constrained, as Jean-Paul said, is changing. So normally the domain of the public sector is kind of this preserved space, and the private sector is over here, right? And these are two separate entities that intertwine at times, but really operate, alongside of each other instead of interdependently. And I think that's starting to change the way Vipul talked about needing to work with the government. And then if the government just cannot operate beyond a certain set of constraints, what is the changing role of UN agencies or the private sector? I just thought I would throw that question to my panelists.
Yeah, it is a fascinating one, right? Like some of the lines are being blurred because, if you're running a government, you've got to make sure food is getting to people. You need to think differently. Maybe you can't just, rely on the set of regulations and policies that were in place in the past. I wonder, Vipul, if we could get you into this discussion because I'm guessing you're growing, right? You're out there trying to deliver food at a moment when people need a service like that. Maybe you need more financing. Maybe you've been out fundraising. What is that like to do at a moment like this from the likes of CDC Group?
So Yasmin was talking about, diligence, and I've been trying to raise capital for my company. And I'm realizing now the challenges of doing remote diligence. It's not funny, let me tell you, when you're on the other side. Because, we are talking to a UK-based investor, for example, and they said, I don't know when I can travel to India again. So how do we do diligence? And I said, I'll do one thing. I'll put somebody with a drone camera and make sure that you walk him around the entire our stores or our fulfillment centers, and you can actually ask questions, and somebody will, and I can answer it sitting on the other side, and all of us can then go through it if we really want to make a site visit. So we are really trying to come out with some very interesting and very unique solutions which you never thought were going to happen. But
and is it working, Vipul? Are you going to be able to get the financing you need quickly enough in a crisis like this?
I think so. I think the jury is still out whether it's working efficiently and quickly enough, and we are learning as we go along. These are still early days, but I think we'll find a solution. And I think there is enough concern and interest on both sides to make it work. So I think we will find a solution which eventually works for everybody. The other side is also very interesting. Yasmin talked about this private versus public boundaries getting blurred. And one of the things that we have realized, and this we realized is when we got in this business almost about a decade back, is that you have to play a public role. Like it or not, your role is not just limited to being a private company where you can say, okay, my job is to my investors, and I just make sure that I get the best gross margin and I take care of it and I deliver it, and I really don't care about anything else. We got in the business, we told our investors very early on, I think almost about 6 years back, saying that one of the roles that we'll have to play in India if we want to be really make this work is to actually uplift the entire supply chain that we have, which includes our people who deliver, the people who pick and pack, the suppliers that we work with. So we actually set up a trust for our employees. And this is a trust where we raised a Series C. We told our investors, we are setting aside $1 million, which is all we could afford those days. And we said, we'll set aside $1 million. And this $1 million will actually, the company can't touch it anymore. It's outside the company, sitting in an independent trust. And this will be used to actually only educate people, to provide them medical insurance over and beyond what the company provides. And also to help them if they reach a stage where they need financial assistance. The guy wants to buy a house, his brother wants to get educated, his wife wants to acquire a particular skill. And we said we'll use this capital only to do that. We have now realized that's been so important for us. We are now expanding it to actually, in fact, we are providing COVID insurance to all our employees across, which is extremely generous. And we said we'll fund it through the trust again. And so we're using that now to actually extend. We are now talking of extending that to all the farmers that work with us. So providing insurance, health insurance, COVID insurance to farmers, education assistance to farmers and their progeny during this period. And so therefore, I think it is important for private enterprise also to realize that particularly in times like these, there is a very significant overlap between the public and the private space. And you have to play that role if you want to succeed in any business. And that's one of the reasons why we have been able to bounce back, Raj. A lot of our employees have come back today and are still wanting to come back and work with us and are working hard even in these times, primarily because they see a long-term responsibility towards the company. And they see, okay, this is a company which has stood by me, has professed care for me and my family, and therefore I owe something back to the company.
Yeah, and I wonder, because we're getting a lot of questions in. You can see my visitor here, Eduardo, joining us. I wonder because we're getting questions in about vulnerable communities, and I'm thinking about the farmers you talked about, who may be at the very beginning of the supply chain, and many migrant workers, as you say, who work in some of these packing facilities.
Absolutely.
I mean, these are people who may not really have a safety net at all.
Yes.
Yes. And they might be particularly vulnerable in a moment like this.
Absolutely.
What are companies doing? What are governments doing? And what can development finance institutions do? We had that question about job protection. It was pretty low in the numbers in that first poll, but I'm just curious, what do you think, Vipul, from your standpoint, we can or should do differently now when we think about the vulnerable communities that are likely to be affected by this?
I think there are three things that we are realizing. One, I think we need to step up investment. If you need to, take care of some of these things. So for example, one of the things that we are now working towards and saying, is there a wage guarantee we can give? So for example, there are a lot of our employees who are not able to join back work and who cannot because they're locked down, their family is not well. And we feel that it's not fair for us to actually deny them salary. They may have exhausted all their leave, so they don't have any more leave left. Is there a way that at least we can provide them a minimum wage during this period, which may be 1/3, 1/4 of what, or at least provide them food and groceries during this period? So we have set up a helpline for all our employees, saying that even the ones who have left us, and saying you can actually call back. Groceries we will deliver. If you can pay, great. If you can't pay, the company will take this expense and fund this. So really reaching out, particularly to your employee base, and we have about 25,000 people. So it's a large base, and this is just directly employed by us. And so we said, let's reach out to partners, to smaller firms which supply to us. We are asking them, saying, what help do you need to get started? Do you need working capital advance from our side? Do you need us to pay you, let's say, 2 months of supplies ahead so that you can start off again? Because you've been shut down. There is no way you can start off. Do you need us to train your people and sanitize your facilities? Because most of them don't even know what to do next. They don't understand, how do I make my factory safe again? What measures do I need to implement? So we have learned ourselves, and now we are sort of providing them training and reaching out and training them, saying this is the way to actually restart your factory. These are the kind of sanitization processes you need to follow. These are the things that if you do, your employees will be safe. These are the mandatory checks and balances that you need to build into your system. So really investing in training, investing in providing some sort of minimum security and food to people within the people who work with us directly or indirectly. This is the first step, I believe. And there is a lot more we can do, but I think this is where we have got started with.
We've got so many important threads that have come out in the discussion so far. I'm going to go to JP for his take on a number of those and a particular questions. We're getting lots of great questions that are coming in from those of you who are joining us. Thank you for being with us. And before we hear from you, JP, I just want to ask the producers to throw up our second poll question. As time is moving quickly in this conversation, I want to make sure we have time to get to it. And while that poll question is up, JP, let me ask you to just talk as people take a look at this question. one of the issues that has come through from our audience is about debt cancellation. You talked a little bit about fiscal stimulus. We talked a little bit about debt cancellation. What do you want to actually see the international community doing in terms of providing the kind of fiscal support either to governments or to businesses on the African continent? What do you want to see done?
Thanks a lot. I think that comes to the crux of the issue. And first of all, we have to understand the scale of the gap that was already there even before COVID, right? The UNECA, we had calculated that to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals in Africa, you needed $63.8 billion per year. And that gap was there already. That was the scale of the gap that existed even before COVID. And we've redone that calculation post-COVID, and it's now 92.8 billion per year. So the financing gap was already very significant. And a lot of that gap can be taken on by the private sector. But in the context of Africa, and I think this came up in previous discussions, that a lot of that also needs to come from direct aid. I mean, there's no skirting around the issue, because in terms of some of the infrastructural projects, some of them can be done as public-private partnerships, but some of it needs to come in as real financing to create a framework that allows other investment to take place and allows the private sector to flourish.
Well, and it's worth mentioning, JP, and I just want to interrupt for a second to say to people, to finish answering that poll, we're gonna take it down now and see what the results are. We asked you what do you think has been most damaging to small businesses during this crisis, and we'll see what the results are on that. But JP, one reason, just to underline why many African countries aren't in a position to finance this themselves, is they are either heavily reliant on exports of energy products, oil and gas, minerals, or other commodities, which have all seen their prices just plummet during the crisis, or they're heavily reliant on tourism. And of course, people aren't traveling. So, some of the core sources of government revenue have really dried up, and that's why fiscal stimulus is so important. And that's a challenge governments are facing at the same time that businesses are facing what you're seeing up here on the screen, a combination of lockdowns, as well as supply chain disruption and consumer spending dropping, and then lack of access to money. So thank you all for answering that poll. Those lockdowns are a significant challenge for businesses. But JP, continue on this theme of what do you want to see the international community do to help bridge that gap, that $90+ billion annual gap that you now see to reach the SDGs?
Well, I think that first of all, a debt standstill in the first instance gives immediate fiscal space. So that's the first thing that we've asked for. In terms of debt cancellation, it may be different for different countries, because we do have to recognize that there are different experiences. There are some countries that are saddled with unsustainable debt, and there are different reasons behind that. There have been conflicts, there have been other aspects, and in many of those countries, we've just got to accept that a debt cancellation is probably the best way to actually be able to move towards sustainability. And we need to recognize that by going in that direction, we'll create new demand, we'll create new opportunities, we'll create new growth options.
And we're not there yet. I mean, just I don't want to suggest people when I use the word debt, that debt cancellation is there. All that's been agreed to, as I understand at this point, is suspension of debt payments. Suspension,
exactly.
Right,
exactly.
Which means the debt is still due, the interest is even still due. It's just due
Correct.
later.
Correct.
And we know this is potentially a long-term crisis.
Exactly. And I think that's necessary in the first instance, a debt standstill, which allows countries to take the money that they were previously sending out of the country and to put it into their immediate response. And as you pointed out, you see the earnings of African countries are very significantly down. The tax base is already low in many of these countries. They're dependent on exports. I think about 40% of African exports are commodity driven, and particularly around oil and gas. And with the depression in those prices, earnings are significantly lower. And there's a vicious circle. The currency depreciates, so it costs them more to service their debt, while at the same time they're earning less in relation to their ability to service. So the debt issue is part of the equation. But the other part of that angle is in terms of, first of all, the options for private sector investment. And the good news is that African countries are very open to that. In the ECA, we actually have an SDG 7 initiative. SDG 7 concerns energy. So we have a large number of actually shovel-ready projects. We're in conversations with CDC actually about this, about investing about creating the framework for investors to be able to invest in renewables, but also in terms of efficiencies, because you can also gain energy benefits by improving the efficiency of older technologies and by investing in new technologies. There's opportunities as well for hybrids in terms of bonds, for example. SDG bonds are a potential opportunity where you can raise money, which is partly from the private sector, but perhaps blended in terms of finance. Could be through the form of sovereign guarantees or through the form of guarantees from international institutions to mobilize new money that goes into the fight against COVID, but also addressing the impact, for example, of climate change. We don't realize because we factored it into our everyday lives, but climate change is already impacting to 2 to 3% every year on African economies. African economies are losing between 2 to 3%, and in some outliers up to 10% of GDP on issues linked to climate change. If we take Southern Africa around Zimbabwe, Zambia, they were affected with a severe drought recently, and that led to 300% loss in terms of their energy generation because they were depending on hydropower linked to the Lake Kariba Dam, just to give an example. So the huge impact of climate change is happening at the same time as the impact of COVID, and the response needs to also address those structural constraints. So investing in energy is one of the key ways that we can link up with the private sector. In food production networks as well, there's a lot of scope for investment, not only in terms of the infrastructure, but in terms of the production network, which includes in terms of inputs, things like fertilizer. It also involves the infrastructure around it, whether it be roads, whether it be the transportation and logistical networks, warehouses, cold stores, the value chain. All of this is areas that investment can come in through the private sector with support from the public sector.
Yasmin, I want to get you into the conversation. Go ahead and jump in with what you want to say. And there are many great questions coming in. I've got to hit you with a couple of them, but go ahead. Tell us what you think.
I was going to pick up on what Jean-Paul said with respect to blended finance. And, I think there's been a movement around blended finance in recent years, notwithstanding. And then in this context, I think there's a very clear spotlight shining on the opportunity that can provide. So when we're looking at facilities, in particular with respect to putting liquidity into the market, whether it's a fund structure or if it's a risk share with a bank, for example, there are several different types of investment structures that would really benefit from someone coming in at the first loss piece. And I think there's, another place where we're seeing the blending of roles between in that case, it would be the more philanthropic or donor money coming together with investment capital to respond to some of the things Jean-Paul was saying.
Yeah, your CEO, Nick O'Donohoe, has a great op-ed in Devex just a couple of days ago that I'd really recommend to people. We can share it in the description because it really gets into some of the many ways that DFIs can respond. And one of them is about shoring up the local banks, which do have a direct connection often to the SMEs. And if those banks are strong, and maybe it's through a blended finance approach that those banks can have the money to get out, you may be able to see more of a fiscal response to the private sector. Yasmin, we've had a number of questions come in. Let me ask you about female entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs. This has been a priority area for a lot of DFIs, but now we're in this crisis situation. What are you doing to ensure that women get the access to finance that they need to either preserve or strengthen their business?
Well, we've had a gender focus in our impact priorities for a couple of years already. We signed up to the 2X challenge with partner DFIs a couple of years ago. And now with respect to the COVID crisis, there is already an initiative across those DFIs, 15 of them, I think, putting together a statement to outline what the negative impacts of COVID would look like on the population of women across entrepreneurs, but also as employees and business owners and people working across the supply chain. If we're not paying attention, I think it's recognized that the women in the context of COVID are a population that will be disproportionately affected. And so we have been highlighting gender risks as part of the job protection guidance that we put out. We have been working with companies in our portfolio that has disproportionately large segments of their employee base that are women to think very proactively about how we can help support their dynamic response to changing needs of their workforce, and in particular thinking as well about the longer term needs for those workforce. So, I think in the early days of the crisis, it was probably natural, and I think this is probably common across developed and developing economies, to think, oh, what is this crisis? We need to go into protection mode and cut costs, and we're going to have to survive, and you go really straight to survival mode. And it was actually really great to engage in a dialogue with portfolio companies who started to say, well, actually, we've worked hard to train this staff, and what can we do that's more adaptive in response, instead of just kind of black and white, we have this number of staff or that number of staff. Well, can we just say, could we change maybe the way the salaries are being paid out, or could we say we're going to kind of utilize this portion and put this portion maybe on hold? I think that Paul was speaking a little bit about that too, and rebalance the way that the workforce is being utilized so that we can actually preserve it and come back to it when we're ready to scale back up again, and not lose the investment in that workforce that we've made, especially when they're women. And so I think with respect to the employee segment, we're seeing it come up in those types of ways. With respect to access to finance, I mean, that was a problem prior to the crisis. It's probably, exacerbated now. And I think it's front and center on our minds, as I'm sure with many other investors today.
Yeah, and it could be exacerbated by the distance. We talked about trying to do due diligence by video, or, sending around a drone camera. I think a lot of women who are entrepreneurs have suffered from the network effect when you're looking to finance, right? And someone at this financial institution or that financial institution. And if you're not in that network, it can be hard to get the money. And I can see that problem being compounded right now when you can't get face-to-face meetings, you can't break through, you can't go to networking events or conferences the way that you could have, just a short while ago.
That's possible, but I think there could also be positive outcomes. So in a way, having remote interactions makes everything more formal. You don't have the, hey, let's go to the pub afterwards type of thing where some of those opportunities historically came up, right? And so if you are more formal and engaged, actually maybe it levels the playing field in a way that's a positive outcome.
That's a great point. And I do want to get to, before we wrap up the discussion, we still have a little bit of time left. I do want to get to some of the possible positive outcomes. But I'm struck, we've got the title here in Chris's great illustration. We're talking about times of disruption, and there are many layers of disruption. And one of them that we haven't really gotten to is presumably the lockdown. We asked the poll question, and the lockdown is the biggest challenge, is benefiting some businesses. Maybe Big Basket's an example. Businesses that are digital, businesses that are connected to larger networks that can have delivery service, that have strong supply chains. But it might hurt other businesses, right? It might actually impact a lot of other kinds of companies that are out there, maybe including some that are in your portfolio at CDC. I'm curious, from all of your standpoints, how you see this issue of disruption, maybe an accelerating disruption of trends that existed even before, affecting small and mid-sized businesses in the context where you work. Anybody want to jump into that question?
I'll start. I think we have a few exciting companies that are stepping up at this stage and doing really interesting things. So we have a company in the portfolio of one of the venture funds in India that we've invested in, and it's called Niramai. And its product prior to COVID was an artificial intelligence-based breast cancer screening tool, non-invasive. And right now they're looking at whether they can adapt the technologies that they've been developing to think about fever-related COVID diagnostics. And it could be a tool, for example, it wouldn't probably be at a medical grade, but it could be a tool that offices could utilize to scan workers as they come in the door. So I think that kind of pivot or addition of new products that companies could be developing in response to this stage, and not just for the next 3 months, right? I think this is the type of thing that could be utilized over the longer term for more purposes. I think those kinds of disruptions are quite interesting.
We are seeing a lot of food companies, for example, launch health-based products, because these are certainly in demand, and consumers have become a lot more health conscious. So a lot of traditional, CPG companies who did not have a health portfolio have launched a whole host of new health products.
Give us an example. What kind of health products are these consumer packaged good companies providing?
Are, Indians believe a lot in this Ayurvedic formulations. So you have a lot of products, health-based immune system which develop your immune system, products based on that, which help you, or actually the ones which you can take to reduce your weight, or manage your blood sugars, or manage your blood pressure, all of that. So there are a lot of natural products, and people are now, and those are becoming a lot more mainstream suddenly. And these sort of used to exist on the periphery. In fact, somebody like Big Basket would carry them, but most grocers would not, because they would carry a very small selection. And now we are finding that the range of these products has expanded. A lot more companies are offering these products now, and some of the large companies are actually started launching them under their label. And these have become a large, growing category. So that's an interesting side effect of what's happening. Obviously, the other one is—
I haven't looked, but maybe the prices of ginger and turmeric are going through the roof. I don't know.
Actually, not right now, because I think the supply is large and demand is subdued, because farmers can't access markets. So the market prices are still pretty low.
Jean-Paul, what do you see in terms of disruption in the African continent? It's a continent that already has been leading in many ways in the digital revolution with innovative finance and financial inclusion models, and a lot of connectivity, growing connectivity. What do you see happening there?
Well, I think on the plus side, there's been a lot of great innovation. I mean, we've already seen in terms of the response to COVID, there have been a number of companies that have literally transformed themselves. Either they've moved from other sectors and they've started doing PPE, they've started making masks. We've seen that in Senegal, we've seen that in Tunisia. We've seen a number of, I would say, good stories that have emerged. But I think that despite that positive angle, and there's also the growth of e-commerce, most countries already had strong, for example, mobile phone banking options. This is particularly prevalent in East Africa, and this has been used a lot during the crisis to transfer funds as well to even people who needed support in the immediate. But we need to look at as well the lack of resilience at the core of African businesses. And this is linked to, for example, the loss of spending power in Africa is more immediate. Whereas you'll have a stronger social protection system, you'll have savings, in, for example, the developed world. In Africa, those are not as strong. So immediately the lack of purchasing power in the domestic economy has an immediate impact. And you've got a number of industries that were doing really well. If I take the example of Ethiopia, the export of fresh flowers, this has been severely disrupted because of the changes in flights, the lack of availability in terms of export markets, but even the supply chain, because Ethiopia depends on inputs that come from around the continent. It depends on inputs that are coming through Djibouti, that are coming through Kenya, and the disruption in the SMEs that often provide these inputs has led to disruptions in that context. In the country where I'm from and where I am at the moment, in Seychelles, there's been a boost for the demand, for example, for tuna in terms of exports. There's a lot of demand that's coming up, but unemployment is low in Seychelles, and traditionally in seasons where they had increased demand, they would actually import labor from Madagascar, from Kenya, and they can't do that right now. So there is that integration that actually was happening in the African economy, which was a very positive thing, which has really been impacted by COVID-19. And we need to reinforce the capacity of value chains to adapt, which means looking at more local and regional resilience models and how they can feed into each other, as well as recognizing that you can't get away from the need for having some form of social protection framework to be reinforced in the continent.
That last poll question we had, the number one response was that it's the lockdowns that are affecting business. And you just gave a number of great examples of why that is actually the case. And, one of the reasons that comes to mind first for people might be, oh, well, your employees can't leave and your consumers can't leave their home. But another big one that you've highlighted is, migratory workers, people who have to travel to work. And when that's shut down or slowed down, as Vipul described as well within India, it can have huge ripple effects. I want to try to get to some more of the great questions that we're getting in. And Yasmin, I had one for you at CDC, which is about, you talked of funding the health sector and the food security issues. What about directly supporting public sector funded projects like hospitals and healthcare facilities in Africa and in other low income environments? Is that something CDC Group is looking to do or interested to do given the crisis?
So we do have a portfolio of hospitals, and they tend to be private hospitals as opposed to part of a public healthcare system. That's historically been the place where we can make investments. Today, I don't know how that landscape is changing, if those lines are blurring. That's quite an interesting dynamic to learn more about. It's not something that's in our portfolio today, so I don't really know what more I can say on it now, but I think what we are seeing is naturally the public healthcare system is looking to private hospitals to incorporate them as part of the response. And so where there have been opportunities for our portfolio company hospitals to engage in that dialogue, they are stepping into that conversation quite proactively.
Got it. We had a similar question in a way, which is about the role of nonprofits, of NGOs. You know, often NGOs are working with networks of businesses, often very small businesses at the local level. We haven't talked about the NGOs, either international or national. What would you like to see them do as part of this ecosystem that supports the supply chains and the small and medium-sized enterprises in the context where you all work?
Perhaps I can start on this one, Raj, if that's okay. I think we've been advocating a whole of society approach in terms of building back better. And that means that it's not just government-led. Government has a key role to play in terms of particularly the regulatory frameworks and creating the enabling environment for the stimulus to be distributed equitably and also to have the maximum impact. But it has to be, the needs need to come from a wider consultation with society. There is a tendency, not only if we take it in Africa, there's a tendency even elsewhere that stimulus tends to gravitate towards vested interests and lobbies. And we want to avoid that. And I think there's a great role for civil society to play in enhancing the transparency in following the money. There's a lot of good examples around the African continent where NGOs have been involved, for example, in increasing budget transparency, in looking at where money is going into projects and that these projects are actually being delivered. In Nigeria, there's some examples where they've looked at before and after evidence, photographs that have been done using social media, making sure that money is actually being invested in the public infrastructure that it's supposed to be invested in. And in the context of sustainability, ensuring that we're actually going towards a green recovery. We should not be further subsidizing inefficient fossil fuel-based industries, for example, that are already over-subsidized. And we should, on the contrary, be promoting investments that will generate more sustainable incomes. In renewable energy, for example, just based on existing commitments pre-COVID-19, over 567,000 additional jobs will be created around renewable energy up until 2022. That's under 2 years. So that's just in that period. Now, if we can upscale those investments, we can dramatically increase the job creation around. And energy is a ready-to-go element because there's a lot of private sector investment that can be lined up. There are other areas where it's more complicated. Food production, it's a little bit more complicated, but it's doable. And I think that the role has to be around making sure that the finance goes to the right place. And I think civil society has a key role in highlighting where the money will have the most impact.
Yeah, and I would add that I think that it's really important to remember what the roles, I mean, we talked earlier about the blurring of roles between public, private sector, philanthropic, NGO. But I still think there are places where different types of institutions are best placed to be the right actor. And it's really important that CDC is not trying to solve everything and across the piece. And we work very closely in partnership with our shareholder, the Department for International Development in the UK, which can provide international aid. And there are definitely segments of the response here which are not appropriate for investment. And aid is the right tool. And I would say the same with the humanitarian emergency response that international NGOs can put forward. And so, I think we think of ourselves as a piece of the system, and the response of especially international NGOs is really important right now.
Yes, let me take one of the questions we got and sort of adapt it to what you just said. DFIs have been growing a lot in recent years, all over the world, in the UK, but all over. Do you feel like they are well integrated into the broader ecosystem response, into the broader international aid response, the MDBs, the multilateral development banks like the World Bank and others? Is there enough clarity about what role development finance institutions should play and how it fits in to the broader response when we think about the pandemic?
There is a significant amount of coordination. The European development finance institutions have come together, and then together with the IFC in the US. And there are so many different conversations, whether it's about how do we all think of the question of debt relief, as in moratorium on payment, or how do we look at a specific sector, for example. So what are we thinking about supporting manufacturing and supply chains in terms of the needed healthcare products that will help countries respond to COVID-19? And so across, I think, the development finance institutions across countries, there is that connectivity. And then within the different kind of adjacent universes, whether it's among impact investors or foundations and catalytic capital providers, or the international NGOs, you know, those conversations are also happening often by sector and in, I think, quite tangible and pragmatic ways about what people can kind of build coalitions around and act on. I think that's actually been quite quick to coalesce.
I want to try to get to a couple more questions. You know, we've got people joining us on LinkedIn Live as well as YouTube Live. And one person on LinkedIn has asked us about the Caribbean. We haven't talked about that region yet. We've mostly focused on Africa and South Asia. Do these same themes apply in the Caribbean? The questioner is saying, hey, there's a lot of opportunities for agriculture in this region to be strengthened. Any thoughts from any of the panelists, maybe you, Yasmin, or others?
We don't work in the Caribbean, so I'm not best placed to comment on that.
Well, I can speak from the perspective of personally coming from a small island developing state, which has a lot in common with the Caribbean countries. And I think the core vulnerability to external shocks is very strong. A country, if we take the example of Seychelles, where I'm from, the problem is the narrow resource base. Seychelles is very dependent on tourism. 38% of GDP is linked to tourism. And if you take the Caribbean, the reliance is similar. And we've seen that in the context of hurricanes when they've happened in the Caribbean, that the need to build back afterwards, it is very challenging. There's huge loss of jobs and of incomes. And COVID-19 is going to have that same kind of impact. And I think it's important to look at the way in which you can build more resilient sectors. It's not easy because you're not working from a very large base. In these kind of countries, you can't do 1,000 things. And I think the opportunities for agriculture, for food production, which is locally based, which can feed the tourism sector is absolutely key. Looking at organic production, because the production costs tend to be higher in smaller economies. But you can factor that into your branding around a positive experience, around a healthy experience, around a clean production, a circular economy, green economy kind of model. And one of the things that I did when I was working with the Seychelles government was we developed a blue bond, which actually attracted private sector finance with a guarantee from the World Bank, aimed at investing in semi-industrial and artisanal fisheries. And the whole idea was to recognize that we didn't want to increase the fishing effort, but we could create more sustainable incomes for people already involved in the fishing sector by getting them involved in more processing themselves. And that meant investing in cold stores. So the money that was generated was aimed particularly at increasing their input in the value chain and their participation in the value chain. And I think a lot of small island economies, that's where the focus needs to be, on looking at how you can empower your existing operators in the value chain and make them more resilient and get a higher value for the same product.
Great points. I'd love to come back to them if we have time, because I want to talk a little bit more about climate. But briefly, I'm going to ask the producers to throw up the last question, the last poll question, which is, what factor is mostly contributing to the fragility of jobs and markets in emerging markets? We want to understand where people think the fragility of jobs is coming from. And maybe at the same time, that's an opportunity for me to ask Yasmin another question that we got in from our audience, which is really about your portfolio companies and what they're doing when it comes to job protection. You know, how have some of those portfolio companies dealt with needing to lay off people or needing to put people on furlough? How have you seen that handled in your portfolio, Yasmin, as people answer this poll question?
So naturally, that's a sensitive question. I think it's fair to say that different companies are experiencing very different circumstances in this regard. And, you know, I think for the most part, when we make an investment in a company, we have a very honest and open dialogue with them, and I'm sure people can attest to this, about how the company should engage with the workforce. You know, we have an environmental and social action plan put in place with each investment that goes along with the impact thesis of our investment, which involves reference to job quality for the employees of the firm. And so from the start of our relationship with the company, we're very clear about what the expectations are about how employees should be treated, whether it's health and safety or, you know, from other quality aspects of employment. And so in this context, I think we benefit from having set the foundation of the conversation with our investee companies already with that tone. And so our partners are looking for the same things as us, which is to be responsible as employers, because we wouldn't really be in an investment relationship with a company that didn't have that culture at its heart. And so, yes, they're facing tough decisions. They're seeking guidance, and we've put together this job protection guidance and guidance for all different types of stakeholders, whether it's employers, investors, or financial institutions who are putting money into these businesses. What about customer protection, for example, in the context of COVID-19? How do you think about employees and protecting the customers in that kind of physical interaction they might be having? What about the construction sector? How do you handle a remote workforce? There's a guidance note about business integrity in this context as well. So there's been a significant engagement from the CDC Impact Group to put out this type of guidance to help support the companies. And then I think, as I said earlier, the companies are also working to think about the longer term. Yes, there is a significant hurdle to overcome in the short term, but when you're able to return to kind of full capacity of business, you don't want to lose the workforce that you've worked hard to train and recruit. So how can you adapt and accommodate in the interim?
Let's look at the results of this poll if we can. And then in the remaining time we have, we're going to hear a final thought from each of you. You know, you can see it's tough in my mind as well to think about, you know, what are the many factors that make the situation so challenging, so fragile, thinking of the flip side of resilience right now for jobs and for markets. And here we've got the plurality saying it's a lack of access to capital. But of course, there is still a third who say it's about the globalization and competition and interconnectivity. So I wonder if we could get a final thought from panelists about where they see things heading. And I maybe start with you, Vipul, because of this idea of broader trends that were with us before we had this pandemic. Maybe the pandemic is accelerating them: digitization, competition, globalization. Where do you see things heading, Vipul? And what are your final thoughts on this topic of building resilience during this time of disruption?
There are three things which I think will be required for people like us to build a more resilient business. I think fundamentally, one, I think we'll have to invest more in infra. So we'll have to put more capex out in building more storage. For example, one of the biggest issues that farmers have had today is that they have excess production and there's nobody to buy, and they don't have access to markets. Now we know those farmers. Unfortunately, we don't have the storage facilities today to buy and store it. And so that is going to waste. So just investing in capex for storage, investing in capex to make sure that we are able to provide fault tolerance will actually help everybody. The second part is will require more technology. If you need to handle very, supply chains which are very variable, and every element of the supply chain is varying, you need a lot more deployment technology to make sure that they are more efficient, that you can actually reduce wastage and react very, very quickly. And the third, I think, investment that will be required is really in terms of building resilience in people. And that will come from training, that will come from investments in health and safety. And if we do all these three, I think we'll build a more resilient business.
Thanks for that, Vipul. Yeah, we've now heard this theme of infrastructure from JP and from you, technology investment. It sounds like this is a moment to invest. What's your thought, your final thought about this issue?
Sorry, was that towards me, Raj?
That was to you. That was to you, Jean-Paul.
Yes.
Yeah. What are your final thoughts?
No, firstly, I think, as we've already said, we're in a situation where immediate response is needed. In the context of Africa, that means in immediate, it's financial resources in the very immediate. Now, the way that financial resource stimulus is structured can help us address many of the problems that we had even before the crisis. If we structure it in the right way, by investing in the right things, and I agree with the priorities that Vipul has mentioned. You know, it's about investing in the right infrastructure that then creates a snowball effect. If you invest in the value chain of food production, which involves the inputs into food production as well as the infrastructure such as storage facilities, such as roads, and its electricity and its water. By investing in all of those elements, you create growth because you will create the environment for businesses to flourish of different sizes, from the smaller ones to the larger ones. But there has to be that investment which is counter-cyclical. We have to invest now at the point when maybe you're taking a risk. And we need the DFIs, I think, to lead that investment with the right structure from government. I agree as well with Yasmin, the point that she made before. Everyone has to understand their role, and the key role that governments have at the moment is to make sure that they have that right environment to structure those investments and ensure that there is accountability as well around those investments, that investments go into a proper green recovery and not in maintaining investments in sectors that have led to inequality, that have exacerbated inequality, that have exacerbated negative environmental impacts and pollution, and rather foster that green recovery that we all want to see. Thanks very much.
Thank you, JP. And you're so right. While this is a huge challenge, there is an opportunity embedded in this as well. Yasmin, a final thought from you.
Yeah, so this is going to sound like it's coming out of left field, but it's very much on my mind, so I'm going to use this forum to put it out there. I think I agree with Vipul that this is a moment where the ramp up of technology is going to be significant in whether it's managing supply chain volatility or even in health risk management, right? I mean, test is what the World Health Organization said, and that's all about collecting data. And so I think there's a great opportunity in having access to that data. And I think about, you know, how everything's gone digital, everything is online, connectivity is better than it's ever been. We will have much better information that also involves a risk. And I just want to, you know, put a shout out onto the privacy and surveillance community. And I know there's a significant civil society voice that's raising the alarm around this. Because I think now is a time in an emergency, it's easy to take all the walls down and say, no, but we need to solve this. So, you know, put aside all the concerns and all the worries that we had. We need to get to the right answer. We all need to survive. I mean, this is about survival. So, so let's surveil the population and find out where the hotspots of outbreak are. And, you know, and then afterwards, it's very easy to just leave it in place. And so I would just, I would just like to say, I think there's a huge opportunity in the technology that will arrive in this moment, but there's also a lot of risk. And I think that risk was coming anyway, but it's probably accelerated now.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I'm glad you brought it on the table, Yasmin, and something we're covering at Devex. You know, you're seeing an acceleration of many of the trends that were with us before, and obviously privacy, data security were issues before, but things are moving really quickly now. You know, day by day, week by week, decisions are being made that will be with us for a very, very long time. And I think that, to JP's point, that comes down as well to what we invest in and what our priorities are. And we got a little bit into that. I really appreciate the thoughts from all of you on what that future is going to look like. And in fact, we're going to be having another conversation with the CDC group coming up. And that conversation is talking specifically about environmental resilience. So I want you all who are watching this to stay tuned for it. Environmental resilience post-COVID-19, moving the needle on climate action. It's the week of June 15th. And it's part of a series of conversations we're doing with CDC Group, because there really is, as JP said, a big opportunity here to not just get through this crisis, but reshape the economies that are so important around the world to people's livelihoods and to long-term environmental resilience too. So I just want to say a big thanks to all of you. I learned a lot in this discussion. It went by really fast. I want to say a big thanks to everyone who joined us from around the world, and for all of your great questions and contributions. Stay tuned for more, and we really appreciate it, and stay safe wherever you are in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Raj. Thanks for having us.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you.